Welcome to the Westport Library. Thank you all for coming out on such a wonderful night. Tonight, the Westport Library is proud to present Nicholas Dawidoff and his book, The Other Side of Prospect, A Story of Violence, Injustice, and the American City. Nicholas Dawidoff is the author of 5 books, including The Fly Swatter, which was a Pulitzer Prize finalist. He is also the editor of the Library of America's Baseball, a literary anthology. A graduate of Harvard University, he has been a Guggenheim, a Civitelli Ranieri, and a Berlin Prize Fellow, and he's currently a contributor to The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, and The American Scholar. What you may not have known is this book. It was a finalist for the New York Public Library Nonfiction Award, and it just won the American Society for Journalists and Writers Award. And just yesterday, he won the American Bar Association's Silver Gavel Award. So yes. Tonight, he will be in conversation with Althea Seaborn, who is a professor at Norwalk Community College, a former Assistant U.S. attorney, and an former assistant district attorney. And she's been very active with Team Westport. Just so you know, we will have time at the end for your questions and for buying copies of The Other Side of Prospect so you can get it signed by this now award-winning author. So without further ado, Nicholas and Althea, come on up. You can sit either way.
Hey, good evening. I told Nicholas a little earlier that, oh, it's not? Oh, okay, sorry about that. I was telling Nicholas earlier that the book was so fascinating that I am using it in the fall in my criminology class. It covers so many topics, so many issues that are relevant in my class. Well, my first question for you is, what led you to write this book?
I just want to say thank you for that lovely introduction, and thank you, Althea, for doing this with me. And, you know, this book was so many years of work that I have just encountered so many people who were so generous with me, and some of them are here, so I just want to thank Eileen and Carter Wiseman, and also Ken Rosenthal, who is one of the people who is in the book. And I always thank a wonderful organization called Art for Justice, which has been such a loyal, and there's no other word but loving, sponsor of my work. The book began with my childhood in New Haven. I grew up in on a rented floor of a 2-family house with a single mom who was a school teacher and worried about, money and things like that a lot. But she also filled our childhood with books and culture. And she would go on these sprees. So I remember suddenly there were all these Virginia Woolf books, for example, in the house. And the way you got to know the city of New Haven was, there were many ways to know where you come from because childhood is so defined by places. And one way that I got to know New Haven so well is by riding my bicycle to various fields all across the city as I advanced through the youth baseball leagues in the city, which I played all the way up until I went to college. And so, for example, if you went to Fairhaven, as I did in my early teens, you were playing by the Quinnipiac Projects. And, at that point, I was going tuition-free to a private school across town where all these kids, when they smiled, their mouths were silver. And it took a while to understand what braces were. So then, one day, I'm playing on my baseball league in the summer, and a kid slides into second, and his mouth is silver. And he's the only kid in the whole league because you know your opponents and you know your teammates, you know the people who come. And I thought about that. And then a year or two later, I was playing in a neighborhood called Newhallville. And I was standing out on the field, and my position was shortstop, which canted me so that I could look, uphill, so to speak. So I look across the expanse of the neighborhood and then up the hill. And Newhallville was a post-industrial neighborhood that had once been a source of social ascent. It had been where middle-class people lived who were working industrial jobs. Many had come from places like South Carolina at the end, but it went all the way back to the 19th century when people came from Ireland and then Italy and then Eastern Europe. And it was a neighborhood formed by work and by opportunity. But by the time I was playing baseball there, the factories had all closed and there were no jobs. And so it was a neighborhood that had been in sort of post-industrial decline. And I was playing amongst people, I mentioned my mom and what our household was like, but I was playing with people, my friends whose basic needs were not being met and whose families were really struggling, and it was a serious thing. And as I looked across the field and up the hill, there was the Yale University, and you could see the towers, and you could see sort of the lush greenness. And standing there in my position, I just thought, it was just so abrupt and in your face, these demarcations. And I just thought, you remember very vividly these moments in childhood, and I thought, how can this be, and why should this be? And I wondered what it felt like. And we kids didn't ever talk about personal things like that, but that's really where it came from.
It's very interesting, and there's so much in this book that I actually can connect with. One thing is that my family was part of that great migration from South Carolina, and some ended in New Haven, in Newhallville. Now, is there a passage that you can read for us to start us off?
Sure. I will say, speaking to South Carolina, so the neighborhood is constantly being reformed, as I said. And if you go to New Haven now, if you drive around the city, you'll still see most Connecticut license plates, but second most South Carolina license plates. They're South Carolina because so many people heard about work, and they came and they told friends and family and so forth. And so there are many, many families that retain a close attachment to South Carolina, also North Carolina, Georgia. I can just give you a little sense of the book. Where it goes by, I'll just read you the first paragraph. Early on the summer evening of August 1st, 2006, on a mournful New Haven side street, an elderly man from another town who just cashed checks worth nearly $2,000 was sitting in his cream-colored luxury car. A young stranger appeared at his window and killed the man with a single point-blank gunshot to the neck from a .45 caliber pistol. A .45 is a weapon so powerful, it's a handheld artillery piece. Few people are murderers, fewer still kill strangers. Far fewer, again, are capable of such an intimate execution. Another stranger, a 16-year-old boy who was blocks away inside a pharmacy, went to prison for the shooting. Whatever muted outcry that followed in the city was soon undercut by the settled belief that these were the things that happened. The conditioned insignificance of the crime carried its significance, and three men, inextricably bound by violence, was the gone grandeur of cities, the end of new beginnings, and old, unresolved American history. And what I would say is that the man whose name is Pete Fields, who was killed that day, came from a family that lived in rural South Carolina, and they lived what was in effect the recurrent Newhallville, it's not exactly a dream, but the hope, which is that you come, you work hard, you buy a house in Newhallville, and then eventually you move up and out, as he did. But he loved his old neighborhood, and he used to come back, and he used to socialize with a group of men who he called his Carolina homeboys, who all socialized at this social club, which they called the Mud Hole. And they played cards there, and they cooked, South Carolina-style barbecue, and they reveled in both their past and their present. And the young man who was accused of killing him and went to prison for it, who didn't actually do it, and the young man who most likely did do it were both similarly from families that came from the same region of South Carolina, only later. And when their families came, the difference is that the opportunity was gone. There were no more jobs. And if when trouble comes when the work goes away, it's really that simple.
So can you kind of tell us a little more about kind of what contributed to the violence? And what was the level of violence in Newhallville?
There are many things to be said about violence. I think of violence as, and I, wonder if you agree, since so much of your work involves similar issues. But I think of violence involving as an extreme expression of broader issues, the kind of violence that we're talking about. And I guess I could say a few things about it. First and foremost, typically, violence occur even in the highest violence communities in this country. It's a very small number of people who commit violence. Typically, the people who are committing violence are also victims of violence. So you're a perpetrator one day and a victim the next. The reasons for committing it are many, but one thing that we certainly know is that among the predictors of young people who are going to get involved in violence is exposure to violence as a young person, either seeing someone who is injured, either shot or some form of abuse, losing someone you're close to, losing a parent, and then a series of traumatic other experiences in childhood. And you can't generalize for any one person, but a succession of those experiences is typically what you will find, as people in Connecticut have who've gone and interviewed, as I did too, many, many people who are in prisons in Connecticut for committing either mayhem or murder. And the other thing, important thing to say about violence, I think, is its effect on a community. You can think of shark attacks in say a Massachusetts beach town. If there's a shark attack in a beach town, everybody knows about it, everybody's terrified, and it doesn't take much for nobody to go into the water, right? But in a community, when there's violence, it's the same feeling. It doesn't take much, but then people can't get out of the water because this is where they live. And so it has an absolutely terrifying feeling. So another thing that really, really contributes to violence, I think, is fear. That lots of people acquire weapons, which in our time are really, really easy to get. And people have guns, and they're carrying them for protection. But once you have something, the temptation to use it, and when you're young, to make terrible decisions based on sometimes things that often to police officers seem really trivial, is nonetheless something that really happens. Most people who have guns also, they don't intend to use them for any sort of malice. They're thinking of it either self-protection, or they're thinking of it in the way maybe you do an iPhone or something, that it's a cool machine and that there's a kind of credibility and a kind of also, it's almost there's a fashion, kids would say, to having it, that a gun. And if this sounds strange, just think about the gun ownership across the country in middle class, communities. It's the same reason that many, many people in this country own and collect guns.
So what can we say, though, about the fact that so many people in New Hallville are possessing guns out of fear, and the fact that they have the New Haven Police Department there to protect them?
I think, there's the temptation to answer a question like that and to generalize. And I guess one of the things I would say is that policing is like any other profession. It is, people approach it in different ways. One of the things, I learned a lot about policing, and one of the things that I saw is how dependent policing is on leadership. And that, when you're dealing with organizations with many, many people in them, invariably, there will be different kinds of people who work in the profession. But it is absolutely and fundamentally true in police departments that there are policies and ways of going about business that are encouraged from the top. And in this particular case, which happened in 2006, it was a very different kind of hierarchy that existed and a different kind of message that was coming from the chief's office than exists when I'm beginning to write the books, close to 10 years later. At that time, the response to increased violence was placing a primacy on solving cases and solving them as quickly and as in much multitude as possible. And this leads to exaggerating the performance of some police officers and also placing a primacy on police officers who are notching many arrests. And so the mistakes that were made, I think that, we're talking about a young person whose confession was coerced. I don't think that the confession was something that the police set out to coerce. I think they had an idea of the crime, they trusted their intuition, and then once they had an idea of the crime, it was very difficult for them to deviate from any information other that seemed to support their idea of the crime. In other words, tunnel vision. So many mistakes were made, but I think the first mistake is a different kind of policing says that you solve crimes before the crimes happen by getting to know your community, getting to people to be familiar with you, coming to a sense of how things work, creating relationships so that people trust you, because it's an information-based business. And you can't solve crimes, which you're responsive. So you can't solve crimes if you aren't coming in with people who can help you to understand and to learn what happened. It's a difficult thing to do. And I think in this particular case, there wasn't a lot of information, which gave opportunity for people who had ill intent to offer false information and to lead police officers in the wrong direction. And those police officers one of the two police officers who worked this particular case was someone who since childhood had known this neighborhood well. It was a predominantly black neighborhood by then, and he was a black police officer. And he had a lot of credibility within the department because the department itself didn't know the neighborhood well. So they trusted this particular officer too much, and they entrusted in his expertise, which at one point probably really did exist, but at the time that this case happens is exaggerated, as is his own sense of his ingenuity and aptitude for solving cases. And so all kinds of subtle things go wrong, and they contribute to making a terrible mistake.
Yeah. So, yeah, definitely makes sense. So how was it that Bobby ended up with his incarceration?
So picture a neighborhood where there are lots of young people who, like in any other neighborhood, in their spare time want to be with other young people and have fun together. And in a neighborhood where there isn't a lot for kids to do, kids gather in places that in other parts of this country would seem unlikely. So in this particular neighborhood where a lot of people gathered was outside a store which was known in the neighborhood as the 2-4. It's a little neighborhood corner store, and all sorts of people from teenagers all the way on up to young men and young women would come there, and all kinds of people would come there. People would come there and they'd play music on their car stereos, parked cars, and people would dance and they would talk and they would socialize and they would flirt and they would have snacks that they bought in the store. And then there were some people there who were selling drugs and other people who were politicking and, planning, criminal behavior. But most people who were there weren't doing those sorts of things. They were just there because this was the fun place to be. And Bobby and his friend Kwame were like a lot of kids. They wanted to go there because, as they said, it's the bright lights. But if you are the kind of police officer who doesn't know the difference between Bobby and Kwame and kids who are deep into the streets and who are at this point a little bit unhinged and running around with guns and using them, that's when you get into trouble. If everybody looks the same to you and you don't know the people who are the community that you're serving, that's where trouble comes. And so Bobby was just another kid in the neighborhood, but he was hanging out in a place that put him proximate to suspicion.
And Bobby was 16 years old?
He was 16 years old when he's arrested, yeah.
And how about Kwame?
14.
Okay. And so how did this evolve from him getting locked up and him ultimately being exonerated?
So what I told you about my childhood is and how I came to this. That's a theme, that's an idea, but that's not a story. And this is something that I've been thinking about all my life. That moment is something that really stayed with me all my life, and I'd been thinking about it. I would come back and see my mom in New Haven. I at a certain point lived in New York, and I would come back and see my mom, and it was the same thing. You read the New York Times, and it's the two Americas, the two Connecticuts, the very wealthy state with the three impoverished, supposedly very dangerous cities, the two New Havens, and this was something that I was very much aware of, and every time I would come back to New Haven, I would see it wasn't changing. And at a certain point, this felt like a very difficult thing to do because it brought together so many different threads of inquiry. You know, you weren't writing just about violence or policing, you were also writing about industrial history, you were writing about, you know, immigration patterns, you were writing about many, many things, and it all had to thread together and read as a narrative. And I felt that I had a sense that this would be difficult and well worth doing, and I didn't want to screw it up. I wanted to be ready to do it. And at a certain point, I felt ready, and I came back, and New Haven is a small enough place so that people hear what you're doing. And one day I got a phone call from this lawyer who said he'd heard what I was doing from, you know, one of his family members whom I'd met. And he said, you know, I know somebody whose experiences really speak to, I think, what you're trying to do. And what I was trying to do was I was trying to write about a neighborhood. I wanted the main character of the book to be the neighborhood, the voices of a community, not just any one individual person. But you needed people who could be kind of an everyman, if you know, someone who could, who was an extraordinary, ordinary person in a way, whose life experience could speak to this. And when I went to this lawyer's office and he told me about his client, and he told me that his client was in prison, and he'd been in prison for, at that point, 8 years for committing a murder, which he had confessed to, but which he hadn't actually done. You know, as I heard about this person, something about him just sounded really appealing, as did the lawyer, who, by the way, I think is here. And so I went with this lawyer, whose name is Ken Rosenthal, to the prison, and I met this young man, Bobby. And what I was struck by in Bobby was several things. One thing is that for someone who was accused of being dishonest about something that would make most people incredulous, confessing to the worst thing you can do to another person when you didn't actually do that thing, my first impression was that he was frank and that there was candor. He wanted me to know that he wasn't a saint, that everything he said about himself seemed so bluntly true that it was really confusing that he should be, you know, in this position for blatant falsehood. And I was intrigued by that, you know, sort of a paradox. And then also something that seemed true to me is that when he spoke about his childhood, he could recall his own childhood, but also the childhood of people he'd grown up with really beautiful acuity. He could speak, it wasn't that he was poetic, it's that he spoke with recall and compassion and detail, so that he not only could tell you about his experience, he could tell you about the experiences of other people in a way that showed that he wasn't judgmental, he was appreciative. In other words, he was taking it in. If people were doing things that he didn't think well of, he would tell you about those things, not in a way to discourage you also from not, you know, from thinking poorly of, you know, people who are committing violence and so forth, but he could also ground it in sort of, he could orient you as to how it might have happened. He could tell you why things happened, how people experienced things that happened. He could, and, you know, it turned out that there were little similarities in our childhoods too, which, you know, made us feel a kind of rapport. For example, he called himself a traveler. He had a bicycle and he rode up and over this hill that I described from the baseball field, and he rode around New Haven. And this was a very rare thing in his neighborhood. Most kids didn't go exploring around the neighborhood, but he did. He was really interested in the city. He also had, like me, had grown up with no father in the household. And he told me that, you know, that he used to watch television and he was watching for the advertisements because he felt as though he was missing some basic information about how to be a grown-up man. And this was certainly something that I always felt, that there were things you were supposed to know and that the person who was supposed to give you that knowledge wasn't there. So even if you got that knowledge, even if you learned how to shave or whatever you learned, you weren't learning it in the right way. And as he talked about those things, I felt, you know, we're very different people, but on basic levels, I felt as though this was someone I trusted, not just because I thought he was a truth teller, but I thought that he was so unusually observant, you know, and I thought that he could tell about many people's lives in a way that most people can't.
Yeah, he really came through in what you shared about him, what he said, how he even lived inside the prison with that same attitude of positivity and holding himself accountable, saying that on some level he deserved, you know, what happened to him. And
Yeah, many things will strike you in the course of a project. And one of the things that most struck me is that this was someone who I came pretty much firmly to believe had falsely confessed to committing murder, and who was in prison for 38 years for something that he hadn't done. And what I found so poignant and moving, and something that really I want to think a lot about, was his deep desire to understand not only why he did that, but to justify it to himself, to find a way that he deserved this fate. And nobody deserves that fate. But it felt to me, again, deeply human and moving, and I guess also provocative, that this was a person who something had happened to him, and it was an irrational thing that had happened, something that really shouldn't have happened, but it had happened, and he wanted to make that irrational occurrence reasonable. He wanted to find a true explanation for what in his life had contributed. So when we're talking about the course of his life and the lives of people in his community, he's thinking about his life not just in relating, in a sense, an autobiography to me. He's also trying to discover in his own life reasons for his own agency in something that he was a child. He was the innocent kid. It was completely not his fault. But he wanted to find some kind of explanation. And I found that incredibly moving.
yeah, that was unbelievable to me. I have not experienced that either as a prosecutor or even doing defense work or anything like that. Now, what about the involvement of the state's attorney's office, the effort to try to find the truth in this case?
I guess I would just say one of the things that is interesting about this state in particular, one of the reasons New Haven's a good place to write about is that it is a small city with big city problems. That it is, for a city of its size and scale, it's a pretty small place. I mean, but it's a concentrated place. And so there's a civil rights and criminal attorney in New Haven named Mike Jefferson. And Mike grew up in the Bronx, and he came to college in New Haven and law school, and he just stayed. And he told me that in thinking about his clients and in thinking about, also back to his own childhood, that growing up in New York City, New York was too big. But coming to New Haven reminded him of being in biology class and for the first time being handed a microscope. And suddenly things were visible that he hadn't been able to see before. And the New Haven was like that. It was a microscope. Suddenly, in being in New Haven, you could see America because there are all these neighborhoods in many different dimensions of existence, everybody living so close to one another, many different kinds of immigrant groups, many different classes, races, many different, one of the most prestigious universities in the world is hard by a neighborhood which suffers some of the same problems that are going on, outside Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, or outside Duke and Durham, North Carolina, or Trinity and Hartford. I mean, it was a place that could reveal big American problems. And so in terms of whatever you think about the structure of this country, it was a pretty good way to start thinking about it. Also, though, Connecticut is a place, as a small state, where individuals really matter. In other words, in the legal or the criminal justice community, everybody knows everybody. So there is in a place like New York, that wouldn't be true. But here, if people get wind that something has happened, there is the possibility that there are people who are going to hear about it, who are in a position to do something about it. Now, far and far, far away, this doesn't always happen, but the possibility of it, I think, is stronger in a smaller, more transparent place. And so what happened with Bobby is that he had this incredibly persistent and I'm going to just read you a tiny bit about Ken Rosenthal, just so you get a sense of what happened to Bobby. Years later, thinking back to 2010, Ken Rosenthal could no longer remember how it was that he became Bobby's lawyer. Rosenthal was a wholehearted person, someone who occupied himself with legal projects so time-consuming, years of strenuous effort, that they rapidly became what he had always been doing and always would be doing. His moment-to-moment engagement in these cases was complete. He did not defer or avoid or postpone or procrastinate or run errands. When others temporized, he became impatient, might rail against these obstacles to his onward motion. For recreation, Rosenthal was a long-distance runner who at age 65 completed his 3rd marathon in 18 months. But more accurately, all those running races, like his cases, were one single forever race. He didn't care about money, he didn't care about fame, he didn't care what he drove or ate or wore. He had no evident relationship to irons, dry cleaners, combs, fabric softener, or dinner time. When he submitted to family summer vacations in rural Maine, it was understood that he would pack law books, but not his swimsuit, and his days would be spent at the nearest library. Occasionally, there came a morning when he stayed away from the library. Then he could be found at the regional courthouse, observing. To children's birthday parties, he brought the legal briefs he was drafting, and he sat on the couch, penciling improvements amid the hats and hooters. He almost always took on unwinnable cases, put in his all, and lost well more than 90% of them. But against opposing lawyers with the most fearsome reputations, sometimes he won. So this was Bobby's lawyer. Bobby gets this man, and this man is running around the state, literally finding public occasions where people of influence in the state and the chief state's attorney's office or in the New Haven Police Department are speaking, and he buttonholes them, and he tells them what's going on, and he precedes this by asking a public question, and people pay attention to the questions because the questions are good, so that when he comes up to them afterwards, they're receptive to what he's saying, and the next thing you know, he's talking to the police chief in his office, and he's sending massive briefs that he's drafted and letters of information and things, and people start to pay attention. And then one day, up in the criminal justice apparatus, somebody looks at this and says, you know, there's something wrong here. And the person who then is chosen to review it happens to be a really, really good lawyer named Dina Fisher, who also has a somewhat artistic sensibility, which means that she can see when something is somehow doesn't fit the pattern or is outside the norms, and good things start to happen. But you can see how this is sort of dependent on individuals and people in a way that sometimes might not happen in a place with a you know, where there are more people.
That's fascinating. I also want to ask you about where does Attorney Rosenthal, where did he sleep?
You know, I mean, there are rumors that he sleeps. So one of his clients, a different client from Bobby, showed me on his phone. He said that he carried something around. He loved his lawyer, and he carried something around as a sort of a memento of his lawyer, so that his lawyer was with him at all times. But it wasn't a photograph of the lawyer. It was a photograph of this little sleeping mat with a folded yellow sheet and a pillow that was right behind Ken Rosenthal's desk. I hope I'm not embarrassing you too much, Ken. And so this is what the client carried, because when Ken was working on cases, to maximize time, he would work until midnight, sleep until 4 in this little pallet, in effect, behind his desk, and then he would get up and keep working. And this client just loved that he had a lawyer who was so dedicated to him that he slept for 4 hours behind his desk chair in the office.
I love that part of the story, because that's a true dedicated lawyer and really working on behalf of the client. I love it. Let me see, what was the other question I had for you? So now, what was the mechanism that actually got Bobby released?
I would say what got Bobby released is really what's the mechanism? The mechanism is that his alleged co-defendant didn't confess. Ken wasn't Bobby's first lawyer. Bobby had an initial lawyer who wasn't as successful and did what so many lawyers do now, which is he advised him to take a plea. He said, you've confessed, you know, you're going to get a 60-year sentence, but if you take a plea, you'll only get 38. You'll come out when you're my age. And Bobby thought, oh my, how old are you? And he said, well, I'm in my mid-50s. And Bobby was, he's a kid. But in any event, Bobby had a co-defendant who went to trial and was acquitted. And so the mechanism is partially that there was precedent for acquittal. And that the evidence was no different for these two people. And so Ken had a lot to work with, and Ken hired a very fine investigator who found more things for Ken to work with, and Ken found plenty on his own, and the mechanism becomes that. But as Ken would be the first to tell you, I mean, I was lucky enough to go with Ken to be able to see Ken tell Bobby that Bobby was being set free, which is an incredibly moving thing, of course, as you can imagine. Anybody can imagine what it's like when someone who thinks they're going to be in prison for 38 years is suddenly told that they're going to be released, that it was all in effect a bad dream, a big mistake, you can go home. But one of the things that happened is that I met Ken not that far from the prison in Cheshire, Connecticut, and Ken was delaying. In other words, it wasn't that we were immediately hurrying off to tell Bobby. There kept being sort of obstacles for us to leave the coffee shop and go to the prison. And the reason that there were those obstacles is Ken wanted to be in a positive frame of mind when he told Bobby what was going to happen. And it didn't really objectively matter. Bobby wasn't going to be able to leave for 2 days anyway. And Ken wanted to feel positive. Because the truth is that most of us know a lot about mass incarceration. But with mass incarceration, almost everybody who's in prison, well over 90% of the people who are in prison, are going to be released. And once you leave prison, this is called reentry. And so we know a lot now about mass incarceration. We don't know nearly as much about what is in effect mass reentry. And Ken knew, as the fact is that it is incredibly difficult to leave prison and to reenter the external society. And recidivism rates are really high for a whole host of reasons. Because prisons are places that, as Kwame, Bobby's alleged co-defendant, would say, ruin people, as he says, they ruined him. What it takes to survive and to thrive in prison is not necessarily what it takes to survive and thrive in New Haven or Westport or Greens Farms or wherever it is. It's a very different sequence of skills that makes you survive a place which is tedious, which is stressful, which is full of remorse and regret and despair and also anger and some hostility and many other things that have to be navigated in close quarters with lots of other people. Also, there's the weight of whatever brought you to prison. And while there are exceptions to everything, prisons are not generally still places which prepare people very well to thrive out in the world. So when Bobby is re-entering, when Bobby leaves prison, there's hope because he's, as everybody said, he's a good dude, he's a good guy, he's smart, he's big-hearted, but it's also a really, really difficult thing to do. You have, in effect, you have a scarlet P.
I want you to read a passage, but before that, I want you to tell us some of the things that Bobby did to improve his education, or just kind of prepare himself to be smarter than he was when he went in.
One of the reasons that a good kid would confess to a crime that he didn't commit is because he's truly innocent in the truest form of the word. He doesn't have a lot of worldly experience. He's not, he trusts, he's by himself, first of all, which should never happen, as you know. But he also just trusts these large police officers who are there because he believes in the system. And then he gets very, very confused, and a sequence of things happen that shouldn't happen, and it all goes terribly wrong. And he ends up in prison. And when he ends up there, he's really undereducated, as so many people in prisons are. If you want the #1 predictor for lack of recidivism, for success outside of prison, it's simply signing up for education while you're in prison. If you just sign a form which says you want to take high school classes, for example, already your likelihood that you're not going to commit another crime goes way, way up. Prison education programs, I mean, it's somewhat self-selecting, but they really work. But anyway, Bobby's real education in prison comes partly from, being a good high school student in prison and getting his degree, but it also comes from his experiences with a group of older men who have long, long sentences, who see, as everybody from Bobby's community knew that he hadn't done it. He was known as the innocent boy in prison, and he was someone who a lot of people had a lot of sympathy for, even as they were sort of confused why he had done this, as Bobby was confused. And this group of older men took him on as a kind of as kind of protege. They were mentors for him, and they wanted as best they could. I mean, their second chance in life was to prepare him for a second chance outside prison. And so they tried to teach him not just practical things, but also they wanted him to, they taught him about jazz, and they taught him about Shakespeare. They created a book club where he had to come and he had to give reports. And they would talk about these books, and and if he didn't know a word in the book, they wouldn't tell him what the word meant. They tell him to go look it up. They worked him really hard as they could, trying to prepare him and educate him in some way so that he could come out into the world. And it was pretty, I mean, one of the things that Bobby said when he was leaving prison that was going to be hard for him were these were his first experiences in life with present male older company, which existed in a kind of almost a surrogate paternal way, but a mentoring way too, and what a big difference it meant. And so when I remember how confused he looked when Ken was telling him that he was going to be set free. And later what he said was he was thinking about what it would be like not to have all those men behind him.
I love that. All right, so we can provide opportunities for questions. Can you read a passage to take us through Bobby's reentry?
Sure. So you just need to know a few things for this passage. I told you a little bit about reentry. Bobby's alleged co-defendant, of course, was Kwame, who spent his 15th and 16th birthdays in prison because he couldn't afford his bail and was then acquitted. But he was, as everybody said, ruined by prison. The prison is in Cheshire, Connecticut. It's known to a lot of people as Big Cheshire. Clarence Willoughby is the name of one of the detectives. And something else you should just know about prison generally is that people, to some degree, remain the age out in the world that they went in. That's not very well said, but what I mean is that Bobby's 16 when he's first locked up. And when he comes out at age 25, he's still 16 in external world experiences, right? So some of his priorities are 16-year-old priorities. On any day when Bobby could again be a traveler, moving around, interacting with people, he was at his most optimistic. He wanted his life to permanently open up. Across the difficult first year after prison, the former boy on a bike now made earning his driver's license his top priority. Back when Bobby turned 16, his driver's license wasn't for him a defining American moment or even on his mind. Somebody could always come and get you, he said, or buses, or your friend's mom or dad, we'd all pile in. Growing up in a disenfranchised community, many 16-year-olds from New Hallville didn't pursue their licenses. Glenn Worthy, the New Hallville native who was principal at Hill House High School, said, when it comes up with kids, they say, hush, Mr. Worthy, I don't want to talk about that now. Mostly they can't afford it. Beyond the hundreds of dollars it costs to become licensed, many New Hallville families own no vehicle, making it impossible to secure a car in which to learn to drive, and then to reach the Department of Motor Vehicles, which was miles away out in Hamden. There was also the reluctance to fail, sometimes felt by kids who'd already endured many defeats. Bobby's friend Shay described getting a license as extra stuff. Shay had been 21 and away at college when she finally got her license. She said that for New Hallville kids, there was no driver's ed class offered at Hill House High School and no way of getting to the high school in Hamden where such courses were held. Perhaps the license wasn't even necessary. Bobby's mother and father hadn't, so far as he knew, ever had licenses. A lot of people where I'm from ride around without licenses, Bobby said. This was a practice known to many in New Hallville as riding or driving dirty. Dirty was versatile slang with many applications. Shay said everybody she knew growing up was dirty somehow. Suspended license, no insurance, car taxes. Let my insurance lapse because it was either phone bill or insurance, food or insurance. Which would you rather pay? Car insurance? That was let me pray. This is a lot of people, and you have to drive to make money at your job, so you take a chance. Bobby was determined. He talked about the driver's license as his golden ticket, said to him, it means the world because when I have my license, I can get a job outside New Haven where it's safer. Bobby's desire was to be upstanding, not someone who resorted to driving dirty, who remained unlicensed because he'd been in prison. He thought having the license would now finally make him feel liberated. Bobby's cousin Koya helped him get the formal process started with a learner's permit. She and Granddad gave him a few driving lessons, and then Shay took over. They had glorious times together out on the road. Shay loved to drive, and he did too. 4 months after his release from prison, Shay helped Bobby enroll in an 8-hour accredited course on safe driving practices, where he sat in the back row of the classroom behind all the teenagers. And enjoyed hearing about the potential on-road dangers of a messy car, about how passenger weight distribution affects turning radius. After completing the course came the qualifying tests, first written, then road. Bobby went to the DMV in Hamden to take his written examination, and by the time he got to the DMV, he was visibly shaking. The atmosphere at the squat brick DMV building didn't help. With its uniformed guards, stale smell, the dulled faces of all the people standing by, the DMV could have been a correctional institution. Bobby began his test, and soon a question about skids slid him so far off course, he became rattled, rushed through the remaining questions, just so he could get out of that room, get out of that building. He failed the tests by 1 point. Afterwards, he could barely speak. He was so crushed. The next available test date in Bobby's part of the state was at the Cheshire DMV in mid-April. He could have waited a few days more and gone to a closer Connecticut town, one where he hadn't been incarcerated, but he was eager to defeat the test, and besides, Bobby felt no need to avoid Cheshire. His time was someone else's mistake. He began studying the manual, he said, hard. On his second written test day, Bobby arrived at a coffee shop in Cheshire 3 hours before his appointment time, and he prepared like an athlete. He hydrated with water, ate a banana, and limbered up with practice tests. He wanted a victory in Cheshire. He'd all but memorized the manual, but these practice tests asked for knowledge of the specifics of tire alignment and teen curfews, areas outside the manual's coverage. What was up with these non-manual related questions? When Bobby answered one incorrectly, he jumped up, nearly knocking the table over. On the way to the DMV, Bobby passed the prison. The Cheshire DMV was a much smaller building than Hamden and had the hospitable ambiance of a National Park Welcome Center. As he went in, Bobby was making nervous jokes and saying, "I'm not nervous, I'm not failing, I got this." His dark 26-year-old face contrasted with the rosy white teenagers who were arriving with their parents for the test. As the woman at the front desk signed him in, she took a practiced glance and said, "You'll do fine." Then she advised Bobby, "Take your time." Once registered, Bobby disappeared down a hallway. 40 minutes later, he emerged, arms raised, roaring, high-fiving, cheesing. His test score had been nearly perfect. There had been several questions identical to those on the practice test. It seemed like all the answers were popping out, he said, speaking in a joyous rush. "I'm souped, I'm turned, I'm ecstatic, I'm soup." From the car, he made calls, left voice messages. Passing the prison, he brought up Detective Willoughby. "I don't bear him any grudges," Bobby said. "It's not in my heart to do that. People can do wrong things, and it doesn't make me hate them. I'm just letting people be who they are." Bobby would have to wait 3 months before taking his road test in mid-July. Deferring his wishes, he knew how to do, and he was so steadfast about license preparation, it seemed worrisome to think what would happen when there was no longer the upcoming road test to organize his life. He enjoyed practicing with Shay, she warning, "It's no more smooth-sailing church drivers out there today, Bobby. Don't let anybody break your flow," which was not to say that Bobby wanted the process to last. "I can taste it," he said. "When I pass, I'm going to cry. You'll see tears." The day before the road test in July 2016, Bobby drove around the city practicing what he judged were his weaknesses. He reminded himself to check his mirrors every 5 seconds, to note the speed limit, to place his hands 6 hours apart on the wheel. Near the 24-hour store in Newhallville, he said, "We were sitting there when they pulled me off the porch and arrested me. It was raining that day." Then he beeped a greeting explaining that was Kwame and them. Kwame's group was out there every day. Bobby drove so well you could forget he was practicing. Then when he made a small error, forgetting to signal for a lane change, his hands trembled from wanting something so much. The next day, the weather was hot, bright, and clear. After all the waiting, everything happened very fast. A large, graying white man in sunglasses, a blue agency-issue polo shirt, and blue khakis approached Bobby. The man looked like a country boy state trooper, and it turned out Bobby's examiner was a retired suburban police officer. He asked Bobby to get into the driver's seat, to turn on the car's ignition, to use his turn indicators, first to the right, then the left, to press the brake pedal. As the car crept out of the parking lot, Bobby signaled left, and something in the air lifted.
I love that. Yeah. You've portrayed Bobby in a way that just makes you root for him all along the way. Thank you so much. All right.
Thank you. I mean, it's like, you know, I had a Russian grandfather, and there's this phrase in Russian, and he would say, "That's honey in my ear," but he would say it in Russian.
I love that. All right, I think it's now time for me to stop talking and.
If anyone has questions from the audience, if you could come over here to this microphone, we are recording this event, so this way you'll be able to be heard.
Thanks very much. Two quick questions. First, did you speak with any of the police or the detectives, and did they concede that Bobby was innocent?
I was very fortunate with the New Haven Police Department that several chiefs enabled me to speak with as many police officers as I wanted. The first police chief that I went to talk to was immediately interested, and he said, "You can speak to anybody in my department that you want to. I would recommend that you start at the top of the hierarchy and move down, because that's just the nature of police departments, and you'll probably have better success if you do it that way, but it's completely up to you." And so I spoke to many, many police officers, including one of the two police officers who elicited the confessions. And that police officer was, you're gonna have to read that part of the book because it's just fascinating. I've never met anybody like Detective Willoughby, and he is really a singular, unusual person. And what he had to say about this, I think, I just feel as though, I'm not trying to be mysterious, it's still mysterious to me what he actually thinks. The other detective, Detective Quinn, didn't refuse, was one of the very few people throughout this entire project who wouldn't talk to me. Almost nobody said they wouldn't talk to me, and but he wouldn't. And just as a writer, I say that presents you with a problem, because even though eventually I came to believe that Bobby probably was innocent, as a writer, I'm responsible for everyone. I'm responsible for portraying people in a way that is as true as possible in the concentrated, succinct way that can be done in a book, in a way that speaks to, you know, who they seem really to be. And when you can't talk to somebody as pivotal in a moment as he was in those confession rooms, I felt a lot of pressure to do my very best to be fairest to him, even though I thought quite possibly he'd participated in something, again, in complicated ways that was a very troubling thing to have done.
So in your answer, you said that you concluded that Bobby was probably innocent, but your final conclusion is that he was in fact innocent?
Oh, yeah. No, I've never had any reason to doubt anything other than Bobby was not only innocent, and most likely that this other person committed the crime, but also that Bobby is, I cannot think of anything that Bobby ever told me in the hundreds and hundreds of hours we spent together that didn't turn out to be true. And again, it's my job to be skeptical and to try and find alternate means of verifying things that people say. And I would now say, if you and I were just people talking, I would say, there was nothing about Bobby that I've ever encountered that makes it possible for me to consider that he would have done such a thing, except for the fact that in a world where there is all sorts of violence all over this country, and where strange and troubling things happen that sometimes, I told you what usually contributes to violence, but sometimes there are these aberrant acts, the things that just happen, and they seem inexplicable. And so never would I doubt that there's nobody, I think, who, under the right circumstances, couldn't be coerced into confessing to a murder that they hadn't committed. And I believe that there are circumstances where most people could probably do something very wrong.
So Nicholas, in your answer, you covered the police. Did you speak to any prosecutors?
I did. I spoke to the prosecutor who is involved in this case, and I spoke to many, many other prosecutors and judges. I spoke to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people because I felt responsible for everybody. That in a sense, this case represented not only a criminal justice community, but also a neighborhood. And I had to portray the voices of the entire realm of the criminal justice community that had a Venn diagram in this neighborhood in which it comes together and it has that kind of potent effect.
And in the end, generally, the prosecutors were okay with the finding of the exoneration.
I don't think that people casually release somebody who has a 38-year prison sentence for murder unless they're pretty sure he didn't do it.
Right, right. So the last question is, I haven't read your book, I bought it. I read the jacket and I flipped through the book, and I mean, it's a matter of record what Bobby's name is, but you refer to him constantly as Bobby.
Right.
What's his last name?
The reason I did that is because, yeah, I want to talk more generally about names because it isn't only his name where I had decisions to make. The first, and thank you very much for those wonderful questions. One of the things that I was most concerned about with this book is that I was writing about something that was in a small community, still in effect an unsolved act of violence, that this was an open murder, and it's really two open murders, because the person who likely committed the murder was then himself shot, a 17-year-old kid, a month later. And then he was involved in a series of other murders, which he was about to be tried for. I mean, this is a very unusual young person who gets deep, deep into the streets and starts committing sequential acts of violence, which are pretty unprecedented. There are only a couple of people in several generations of New Haven policing where police officers can remember somebody behaved that way. But one of the many ways that violence occurs sometimes in small communities, and when I say small, I mean concentrated communities, is through social media. And people will hear rumors, and they'll hear things that speak to, in effect, disrespect of somebody's reputation. And when someone who is dead and can't defend his reputation is disrespected, younger people sometimes will contribute to a social media back and forth that can end in violence. Social media really is a source of it's really a sort of a catalyst for acts of violence. Police officers will tell you this. People who work in street violence prevention will tell you this. It's a real thing. And I was really concerned that the way in which I wrote about this particular crime, but also some of the many people in the neighborhood who I wrote about who'd been involved in street violence, that by mentioning them, that my hopes for a book, which are naturally to do some good, would be obstructed by something terrible happening. And so I talked to many, many people, kids in the neighborhood, people in prisons, people in street outreach, social workers, and then lots of police officers about how to do my best to avoid that happening. And so there are a few names where I gave people nicknames rather than their true nickname. And you wouldn't know if I called somebody Spider, or I called him Tarantula, or I called him Spider, or I called him Camel. It wouldn't make any difference to you as a reader, but you just wouldn't want to say, hey, I hear this book out there that's really disrespecting Tarantula, and it's all because this guy Bobby, snitched. Also, Bobby was spending a tremendous amount of time with me, not for me, but for his community. He felt that he lived in a community, had grown up in a community which was really unseen by other American communities, and that this was an opportunity to explain how a place that felt in some way removed from the privileges and the advantages of everyday American life and existed as a place where there wasn't a lot of opportunity, where some of the worst sort of consequences of inequality were falling on people. He wanted people to know what the experiences were like in this somewhat hidden place that was hidden in plain sight, adjacent to, this, among other things, a great university. And so he talked with me over and over and over again about something that was a truly traumatic experience. I mean, it really, to some degree, is something he will never recover from. He will always suffer. I mean, I don't know, but I would guess he'd always suffer from depression and all the many things that come from not only how he grew up, but for spending 9 years in prison for something he didn't do, for his many fears about some of the things that I just said. And so I really felt in the end that, you know, you could understand how a kid who is in prison for something that he didn't do and a writer comes along, that might be advantageous. It's different when he's set free, right? Maybe it was nice to have somebody like me around as he's getting his bearings and things, but he talked to me for years and years afterwards, basically whenever I wanted to talk to him. This was, I considered, an act of incredible generosity, and probably it was uncommonly stressful. So I thought it should be up to him, for some of the same reasons I said at the beginning, how he wanted to be referred to. And so he said he just preferred to be Bobby and not for me to say his last name, so I never do. It's easily, he knew and I knew that anybody could figure out. And as soon as the book came out and people started writing about it, journalists called him and he was happy for them to use his last name. This is his decision and I'm fine with it, but that's why.
If you have a question, come here.
Did you get to speak to the attorney that persuaded him to plead guilty?
No, that was another person who did not want to be interviewed. I went so far as to leave, you know, a letter on his desk chair. I mean, I did everything I could. And many people, I mean, obviously it turns out that he made a mistake, but most people who confess to crimes, I mean, false confessions happen more often than we think they do, but most people who confess to things really did them. And the criminal justice system is set up in its way to depend upon many, many people, most people pleading out. So what he was doing turned out not to have been a good thing. And had he been more attentive, and maybe if he'd had more time, and maybe if he'd been in a better place in his life, there are a lot of explanations for why it didn't go well. But yeah, I was really disappointed. On the other hand, I had a lot of things that are, you know, documents that are public records where I could try and understand. I had his notes. And also, you know, I knew quite a few people who had spoken with him who were participating in Kwame's case and then Bobby's case. So I knew what he had told an awful lot of people. And I then, you know, as I did with the detective who I mentioned, I did my best to talk to as many people who knew him professionally and thought well of him as possible.
Thank you so much, Nicholas, for coming to Westport, and Althea, thank you for your time as well. This has been such an eye-opening experience, and I hope that those of you here in the library tonight will consider purchasing a copy of The Other Side of Prospect. And if you follow Sybil's list, she may also endorse this book, so you should definitely pick up a copy now and be ahead of everybody else. So thank you both so much, and thank you all again for coming out tonight.
Thank you for